Finally, President Jacob Zuma's office says he is to participate in a meeting of BRICS leaders on the sidelines of the G20 summit in St. Petersburg. This will examine progress made towards the creation of a BRICS development bank and a currency reserve arrangement, moves agreed at the BRICS summit in Durban earlier in March. Russian Deputy Finance Minister Sergei Stochak said at the weekend the BRICS members had agreed on the structure of the proposed development bank with a $50 billion in capital, but ironing out difficult details could take months. Now, earlier this week, President Jacob Zuma appealed to employers and unions to try and avert a strike in the iconic but waning South African gold mining industry, which once produced a third of the world's bullion but is now in rapid decline. The conflict between unions and mine bosses unleashed a wave of wildcat strikes that rocked South Africa's platinum and gold industries last year, dented economic growth and led to sovereign credit downgrades. Joining me in studio to look at the future of mining in South Africa is Dr. Velaphi Msimang, Head of Faculty, Knowledge, Economy and Scientific Advancement at Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. Velaphi, thank you so much for joining us. Let's take a quick look at today's decision. We saw some positive outcomes today with some of the unions revising their demands down from 60% to 10%. Is this the silver lining that the industry has been looking for a while, even if it's only in the gold sector?
Okay, so these are the kinds of compromises I think that South African stakeholders in the mining industry need to be focusing on, in that the benefits are good for all of them from working together rather than against one another. And this is a lesson we learned based on the research we did, which was mainly focused on the platinum group metals industry,
right,
but also looked at other strategic minerals.
So if we look at the wage negotiation process in South Africa and how it's evolved over time, we find a situation where there's huge disparities between what is expected by the employers and what is demanded as well by employees. How do we move to a space where we can take the violence out of the process and decrease the disparity that we see from either side of the spectrum? Is there an opportunity to close that gap a little bit moving forward?
Certainly, stabilizing the industry would be the first. If you look at how it's been impacted by cycles in the commodity markets, that is the first source of these stresses. And once you can reduce the impact of those cycles in the commodity sector, one can reduce the tensions that exist. And that is a concept that was developed in our research publication articulated by Dr. Abedian around the idea of metals exchange, which stabilizes or at least mitigates against the cycles that give rise to these tensions.
But when you talk about stability, of course, we've also seen other efforts to bring stability, mainly from the government perspective. We had the deputy president pulling together that framework agreement. We also had the mining lekgotla, which I understand concluded just last week. Talk us through how these two steps are interrelated and whether, at where we stand now, are they enough to move the country forward?
Can I start with the last? Because really our research was more long-term and we haven't really looked at a high level of resolution at what steps are being taken currently. We took a forward approach to look at the opportunities that can be harvested from leveraging our comparative advantage and access to some strategic minerals, including the platinum group metals. And so we really took a long-term view. What is really emphasized in our research is that we have to prioritize stability to ensure that the country can derive benefits and all the stakeholders involved in the mining sector can be happier, and therefore not have to fight one another as much as is the case currently.
Let's stay within the platinum belt. And again, I want to go back to your point about competitive advantage and how it's important to bring stability right now. Where do you see the stability coming from? How do we get there? What are the practical steps that we need to be taking as a country now for us to actually realize that stability?
Okay, it's really about managing and dealing and responding to expectations from the different stakeholders. If you go to those areas where there's violence and disappointments from all stakeholders about, how they are not meeting eye to eye in terms of what needs to happen. In Platinum Group mining activities, you leave some material after extracting the valuable materials. And in our research on sustainability and establishing sustainability, we realize that the opportunities to industrialize using the waste material that's left after the mining process, so that the communities around the mining areas don't only depend on jobs that will emerge from the company that's digging out, the material for platinum. They can supply the construction sector with building materials from the waste material. And we also deal with environmental hazards, which is how we recognize those waste materials currently. But the available resource that can be utilized. That's just one measure in an array of options that can be looked at.
Velaphi, I want to latch on to the point you make about sustainability. Now, we know that to a large extent, if we look at gold sector in particular, many of these mines are maturing, and it's becoming even harder to extract some of these minerals. And because of that, and I'm sure for other reasons as well, we're seeing the increased mechanization of the industry. What should we be doing now to ensure that workers have a sustainable role to play in a transformed industry?
Yes. There is ultimately no alternative to capacitating workers to be able to adapt to the changes that arise as a result of mechanization. It is inevitable. If South Africa decides against mechanization because the workforce is not able to utilize this machinery, other countries that have access to these minerals will mechanize, because the game is about productivity. Now, the alternative, which other countries are already looking at, given the instabilities in the mining industry in South Africa, are substitution. Nanotechnology is beginning to offer a threat to our materials, the same as optical fiber displaced copper in the telecoms industry. So South Africa has to up its game in terms of educating its workforce, educating its population, and Africa in general, in order to be able to remain competitive around the world. Otherwise, will remain in this
very quickly. I mean, we know that we can measure the dent that we've taken in terms of production. We can say that we're down from X amount to X amount. But how do we measure the dent we've taken as a brand, particularly one for as an attractive investment destination?
Yes, that is a tricky one. But the fact that it is hard to measure, quantitatively, makes it even more important for us to be very careful and treat this industry, with the care that it needs to, because it is very quick and easy to destroy a reputation. If our country gets known for its violence and its unstable mining sector, then we won't be able to realize the value that lies in our reserves.
Velaphi, thank you so much for making the time to join us.
Thank you.
Of course, that was Velaphi Msimang joining us from Mistra, giving us his views on the future of mining in South Africa.